Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are joining us from in the world, I'm glad you're able to join us today for the launch of today's historic report, Justice for Africa's Children. My name is Winnie Nyandiga, and I'll be your moderator for the day. So today, we have a distinguished set of speakers spanning 4 continents, from Nobel laureates to heads of UN agencies, from survivors of child labor and a student activist to a business leader and a former prime minister. But to get us started, I invite the remarkable Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi to share the welcome message. Kailash's vision and passion for action on child labor over the last 3 decades are second to none. And I can't think of a better way to get started. Kailash ji, over to you.
Hello, hello.
Kailash ji, over to you, sir.
My dear sisters and brothers, young friends, today when we are launching this report, Justice for African Children, we are challenging the age-old mindset of racial discrimination. We are daring to change and challenge the prevailing systemic, and institutional inequalities. When we are launching this report, we are questioning the unjust global governance. We are also challenging the conscience of the world and trying to simply say that we cannot achieve peace, sustainability, justice, and equality. We cannot call ourselves cultured and civilized. We cannot be proud of our advancement in science and technology if hundreds of millions of African children are living in these situations. If 10,000 children are pushed into child labor every day in Africa, the world cannot ensure sustainability and peace. If we keep on failing our African children, we are bound to fail the future of humankind, the future of the world. I have been saying for ages that Africa is the mirror of global civilization. Africa is the mirror of global humanity. If we are human, then we cannot leave Africa behind. We cannot leave African children behind. And today, dear friends who are assembled here on the launch of this report, I welcome you with whole heart. Because you are assembled here to challenge all those evils, what I just mentioned, especially my young friends. We are so happy that number of leaders from Africa and from other places are assembled here. My dear brother and friend Mo Ibrahim, dear brother and friend Prime Minister Stephen Loven, my very, very dear sister Lema, fellow Nobel Peace Laureate, my friend and brother Martin, the Secretary General of Interparliamentary Union, ILO's Director of Governance, Ms. Vera, young friends Peter, Vinny. I would like to congratulate and thank Owen James and his team, and that means Shara, Vinny, who had made contribution in this report, and Peter. I saw your pictures, Peter and Vinny, briefly when I was logging on. Friends, few minutes ago, I was giving an interview to BBC, and the journalist asked one question: what is the purpose of this report? I said the purpose of this report is to awaken the global conscience. The purpose of this report to create a strong demand, strong voice, and the loud voice of young people in Africa, but also across the globe. The purpose of this report is that the global leaders are bound to listen, that Africa is not going to accept this age old, this ongoing perpetual injustice. African children cannot wait anymore because the youth are standing hand in hands with them. I know that in more than 30 countries, African countries, how our young friends from 100 million campaign are standing up. They have been able to mobilize communities, but they have also been able to meet and talk face to face to the power, to the parliament, and brought their issues. But more important is that whatever is analyzed here in this report, I appeal African leaders to read it. Leaders include the parliamentarians, the presidents, opposition leaders, social and academic leadership. This is just a clarion call coming from the group of young people from Africa, and also on behalf of the Nobel laureates and leaders who are assembled, who are joined in this big idea of bringing such a report. 100 million campaign of young people and laureates and leaders for children. Needless to say that all the resources, human resources, mineral resources, water, energy, gold, cobalt, nickel, cocoa beans come from Africa. And I have met a number of children who were engaged in slavery in various parts of African region, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is unacceptable. When the African children produce this wealth, we are talking about challenging climate crisis and challenging global warming, and looking for safe energy, green energy through these electric cars. But all of us know that many of these things are produced out of cobalt, which is mined in Africa. And the miners are children. A large number of miners are children. But this is, as I said before, that this continues because of the global injustice. There are two or three examples are good enough and which we have been raising again and again. During the pandemic, all of us thought that the world, the international community will learn one simple lesson, that we are not only interconnected, but we are interdependent. No rich country, no poor country can solve her own problem on her own. We have to cooperate with each other. We were hoping that when $12 trillion global agenda of action for COVID-19 has been established by G7 countries, many of African children and children in developing countries will benefit out of it. But is it not a shame that out of these $12 trillion, only 0.2% has been sent to Africa? I'm not talking about just African children, to Africa. Particularly Sub-Saharan Africa was the worst sufferer of these situations. $650 billion fund has been created for what they call this this special drawing rights by IMF. Out of these $650 billion fund, on an average, the money which has been dispersed, $2,500 have gone to per European child, whereas only $50 or less than $50 have reached to Sub-Saharan Africa. Why we call, that's why I'm calling it, there is a serious global injustice in governance. How can we allow, when we say that our global governance systems are inclusive and democratic, what is the justification that there is no Sub-Saharan African country? There's no African countries sitting in OECD. The economic decisions are taken, and economic analysis has been taken. The directions were given through this mechanism of OECD. But where is Africa in it? No African country. We are talking of G20. Only one Sub-Saharan African country, that is South Africa, is sitting in G20 out of 48 Sub-Saharan African countries. This is unjust global governance, and that has to be challenged. We all know that only 53 billion additional dollars can ensure protection for every child in developing countries, not only in Africa, but low-income countries, all low-income countries, along with protection for new mothers, pregnant women. $53 billion. And what is this $53 billion? It is less than 10 days of global military expenditure. It is almost equivalent to 1.4% of what Europeans spend in their social protection programs. This inequality is unacceptable. This report is not an academic tool for our campaigning, for our advocacy work, for our lobbying work. But as I said before, that it is to awaken the conscience of African leaders as well as the European leaders, the global leaders. The entire international community should own this report. That is a reflection, that is a mirror. If we pledge to make this world a sustainable place and wanted to ensure the success of SDGs by 2025 for children, particularly child laborers, and 2030 for rest of the things, how can we ignore some of the revealing analysis came out of this report? We cannot. I make an appeal to all of you that if just $53 billion money can ensure protection for everyone, every child in low-income countries, then we have to propose. Today, through this report, we are proposing very strongly to create a global child benefit initiative where the rich countries can put their part in it, because they have been making all the promises for so many years, and I have been the part of it, where listening in, sitting in very high, in some high level groups and other panels, but they have not fulfilled their promises. So creation of a new initiative, global child benefit initiative, where the children in Africa can get swift and direct support for their education, for their healthcare, and for their protection. I would also urge the African leaders to prioritize the issues of children, marginalized children, in their budgetary allocations. We all know that they have serious constraints, but even then, children have to be prioritized in education, health, and protection, and freedom from child labor and child marriages and exploitation, uh, uh, in prostitution or in trafficking and so on. Second thing is that we have seen the success of school feeding programs in a number of countries, including India and other places. So we request that international community should support, and in whatever manner, not only the international community and the governments, but also corporate sector, faith institutions, international NGOs, everyone should make sure that African children who go to school are fed properly in schools. The school feeding programs are concrete measures, can be concrete measures. Finally, I hope and wish that the young people who are sitting here, academicians who are taking part in it, media and press people, politicians and international leaders who are the part of this launch, they will disseminate it and take it forward. The most important thing is that the fire within this report, the energy in this report, the challenge in this report should be transformed into a collective anger. Anger not for destruction, anger not for hatred, anger not for revenge, but anger to change the shape. We all know that the arch of history cannot be bent in one night, overnight, or in 1 year. We have to continue for it. We have to strengthen our forces, and I would count on young people in Africa, whom I always counted and always respected. Your energy is the change maker. You are the change maker, and you are the champions. Thank you so much. I once again welcome you.
Thank you so much, Kailash G. I agree with you. How, in a more aware age, can it be getting worse? Such an inspirational start. So I'm joined here by my co-author, Owen James, and we're going to do a brief presentation of the findings from the report. So I will be doing the national injustices faced by children in Africa. But to begin, I will invite my colleague Owen to share some of the evidence of modern injustices that have been uncovered in this report.
Thank you, Winnie. So in 2021, the ILO announced a shock increase in child labour. This led to Laureates and Leaders for Children commissioning this report to understand why child labour had risen after decades of progress and what can be done to reverse it. The ILO's analysis showed that the rise in Africa was even worse than the global increase, and it started in 2012. So how can it rise more in Africa than the rest of the world? This graph shows what the scale of what happened. Just wait to make sure the graph is up. Okay, we have a problem showing the graph. So we're going to try and just connect another way. If you give us so for 1 minute. And what we're going to talk about is the scale of child labor, the increase that had happened in child labor, and why. And the report is going to, the report looks at a number of different modern injustices that have happened in Africa and outside of Africa. And so we're going to run through those injustices one by one. And I'm going to talk through some of the international injustices. And we're going to talk through some of the national injustices. Before that, though, I think we are going to go to one of the videos from one of the participants. And we have Prime Minister Lovren joining the event. And we will hear a message from him. And then when we come back, we will start with the presentation.
This opportunity to address some important perspectives and issues in the report, Justice for Africa's Children. This report highlights a shocking rise in extreme poverty and child labor in Africa in the last decade, and particularly since the start of the SDGs. Now, we must understand why this has happened and what has caused the corresponding decline in wealth per person when world wealth has increased by over $10 trillion in the same time frame. The injustice in development financing, low tax rates, and lack of social protection are vital and critical. Regarding aid injustice, I made personal efforts to persuade other countries to join Sweden to realize the promises that richer countries have made repeatedly on the 0.7% GDP development aid target, but sadly, most did not listen. This report shows there has been a shocking shift in ODA away from Africa in recent years. Poorer countries in sub-Saharan Africa now get an average of 23% of the ODA they should receive if the 0.7 aid target was met and also allocated on the basis where the need was highest. In contrast, poorer countries in the rest of the world get an average of 78% of the funds they should receive, over 3 times more. Now, 30 years ago, the average for both groups of countries was the same. Now, this is an injustice that must stop. Broken aid promises have cost sub-Saharan Africa some $742 billion in the first 6 years of the SDGs. And the result is that millions of children have paid the price. When it comes to tax injustice, the report shows that Africa is not receiving its share of global growth despite the major contribution its natural resources are making to the global economy. Africa is home to around 30% of the world's mineral reserves, including 40% of the world's gold and up to 90% of its chromium and platinum, and the world's largest reserves of cobalt, diamonds, and uranium. But much of the profits of these resources are moved offshore, and the resources rarely benefit Africa's children, some of whom are left so poor that they are forced to work in the very same mines. The French government has about $56,000 in tax revenue to spend per child, but the Madagascan government has $134 in tax revenue per child, more than 400 times less. Unless we address this fundamental imbalance, we will never meet the Sustainable Development Goals. There is, though, a critical proven method to protect children from the inequality within our economies. The world spends over $1 trillion on it to protect children. However, this protection is not in place for the children in the world who need it the most. Domestic social protection in the European Union is the largest area of government's expenditure, but in aid financing, there is hardly any support at all for social protection. Social protection forms around 2% of ODA budgets, and only 3% of that goes to sub-Saharan Africa. Now, given the alarmingly rapid rise in poverty in lower income countries, universal child benefits, alongside benefits which protect new mothers, offer a way to stop the increase in poverty and pull children out of child labor. It would have a transformative impact on ending child labor, ending extreme poverty, and at the same time, it will be a historic step for multilateralism. The long-term investment cost of providing universal benefits to every child and new mother in a low-income country is about $53 billion a year, or just 1.4% of what high-income countries spend on social protection. Universal child benefits work. They help end child labor and increase school completion rates. They help grow the economy and increase employment. They have comparatively low administration costs and lower rates of corruption. Global child benefit is an idea whose time has come. The difference, we have the power to end extreme poverty, but we have to ensure all countries have a share of the global wealth. This is not just a matter of justice, as development in other countries and other parts of the world has shown. It is a win-win situation. We will all be better off. So we need a fairer deal for Africa, and we need justice for Africa's children. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Winnie. So we're back and ready to present.
You're on.
On the screen. Okay. So we are presenting the change of number of child laborers since 2012. And you can see there's been an increase of 20 million child laborers. And you can also see that there's been a decrease in the rest of the world by some 30 million. The change in the number of children out of school since 2015, we can see that we've had an increase in the number of children out of school in primary, lower secondary, and at upper secondary in Africa. And we've seen a decrease in the rest of the world by some 10, 12, and 20 million. There's been a huge, huge change. So what has caused that? What is behind that? Well, if we look, we can see the change in the number of people living in sub-Saharan Africa who live on $2.15 a day. And you can see the average rate coming across from 2005 to 2015. And then you can see a major jump coming up when you get to 2015 and the start of the SDGs. And what does that mean? Well, actually, if we look at how the rates work across the different parts of the world, you can see that in 2015, the percentage in sub-Saharan Africa was 47%, and it's risen to 60%. That is a real titanic shift. It's a shift in just 4 years that shows a huge change in inequality between the world's regions. So why has this happened? Well, we looked at the GDP per person, probably the most common way of measuring wealth between countries. And you can see a significant percentage growth in richer regions, a dip for the pandemic in 2020, but it soon bounces back. But for sub-Saharan Africa, it is a very different story. Though the world grew 11 trillion richer between 2015 and 2021, GDP per capita in sub-Saharan Africa actually fell. And if we compare the changes by US dollars, not by percentages, you can see something else. It takes a tiny share of rich country wealth for sub-Saharan Africa to be able to grow at the same rate as other countries in the world. Richer countries would barely notice. But this hasn't been happening. And in fact, since 1980, wealth per person has increased by tens of thousands of dollars in richer countries, 20,000 in high income, 29,000 in North America. Yet in Africa, $96.
Okay.
Now, it has gone up more every 10 weeks in rich countries than it has in 41 years in sub-Saharan Africa. Even the next slowest growing region, South Asia, has grown 15 times more than sub-Saharan Africa since 1980.
Owen, hold on to that.
Sure.
As Owen will take us again through the findings of the report, allow me to invite our speaker to react to the findings that Owen has shared so far. So our next speaker is Dr. Mo Ibrahim. Dr. Mo Ibrahim is the founder of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, an exceptional leader in the continent supporting good governance. Welcome, Dr. Mo. Dr. Mo, we're not able to hear you, your audio. Hello, Dr. Mo Ibrahim. So our technical support, are we able to just share a video of survivor testimony, which is like a minute long, as Dr. Mo is working on his audio, and then we can have him back to react to the report. Georgia, please, can we have the audio of child labor survivors to just show us the situation on the ground and why we are today launching this critical report? Thank you.
Nilipokuwa na umri wa miaka 13 nilianza kufanya kazi za ndani. Kilichonifanya nianze kufanya kazi za ndani, hali ya nyumbani ilikuwa ngumu sana, ndio maana mateso niliyoyapata palikuwa ni kupigwa. Kilichotokea hadi nikapigwa, sikio niliangukaga saa 12 naelekea saa 1 ndo akanipiga. Alipomaliza kunipiga akaniambia tena subiri na mtoto wangu aje nimwambie akupige. Nikasema siwezi kuvumilia haya maisha, bora tu niondoke. Ambacho naweza nikawaambia serikali wasimamie watoto wadogo wasio wanakuja kufanya kazi za ndani wakiwa bado watoto wadogo. Inabidi serikali isimamie watoto wadogo wapeleke shuleni wasomeshe, wasio wanakuja kufanya kazi za nyumbani. Na kama mtu ukimkuta na mtoto mdogo ambaye sio wake na amemwajiri, inabidi akamatwe huyo mtu na mtoto aende kusomeshwa shuleni.
Thank you, sir. Welcome.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're on.
Oh, thank you very much. Let me start by expressing my gratitude for my friend Kalish. I mean, I really admire the leadership and what he's doing. So thank you very much, Kalish, for your wonderful work here. And really, to go to the root of the problem, I mean, it's a question of poverty. Uh, Africa is a rich continent, but Africans are poor. And why are we poor? I think two reasons. One is self-inflicted uh, yeah, problems we self-inflicted in ourselves, and the other because things inflicted on us by other people. Uh, we have been campaigning for almost 20 years now for better governance in Africa. Uh, Governance really is about delivery of public goods, the basket of public goods to people. And as it happened, we have just launched out today our index of governance in Africa, uh, which is shows some issues really about how why governance is halting in Africa and how we're not moving forward, unfortunately. But also there are things imposed in Africa because of these strange public orders, which are also hindering us. And Kalish mentioned that we only need $53 billion to sort out uh, 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 the future of our young people, our children. Let me give you another number, Kalish. Illicit financial flows out of Africa exceeds $100 billion a year. $100 billion a year leave Africa in illicit forms. What are these? This about corporates which shift their profits and misprice their products and take this money out of Africa. $100 billion. That is more than twice the money needed to sort out our children. It's a big problem. It's and why countries are not acting? We keep asking our friends in Europe, United States, etc. Shouldn't we do something about this? Where is corporate governance? Where is good governance in all these countries to stop this theft out of Africa, which is done legally because of the loose regulations? And yes, we're told, yeah, we're doing something about it, etc. I mean, Europe woke up a few years ago and discovered that uh, big tech and other global companies don't pay taxes where they should be. And we said, really? You realize this now? Well, let's hope we need to have some action in that area because we need to stop that bleeding. This is just one example of pain inflicted on us by others. COVID, when it came, hit us. Uh, there was one big problem for our children, which is distance learning. We could not really have effective distance learning for a number of reasons. We didn't have good internet coverage all over Africa, is a problem, although it is improving, but it is a problem. And then the kids don't have devices. There's no point have internet if you don't have iPads or devices, computers to be able to use the internet. So education really was a problem during COVID, lockdown, and exposed the weakness, really, of our infrastructure and the lack of what should be really available to each kid, a laptop. an iPad or a phone or something in order to really use digital learning, which is very important. That was a big problem. Another problem we have also is fiscal space. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. As I said, some of it is stolen, of course, but some of it is also mismanaged. And this is our problem we need to deal with. But there is one big issue facing us really, which is the debt. There is a debt stress now in many African countries. When you look at it, uh, alarm bells are ringing everywhere now about the debt in Africa. I was very surprised when I discovered that this debt crisis is declared a crisis because debt to GDP ratio in some African countries reached up to 40% of GDP. Alarm bells goes up, we have a problem. I looked last week at the debt to GDP ratio of the G7 countries. Guess what? It's 137%. And then I asked the question, why at 40% Africa is in crisis? At 137%, all these great countries at the G7 are fine. No problem. I found the answer to be very simple. The incredible amount of Africans have, while that 137% they are fine. Why is that? This is the fictitious risk premium of Africa. It is a premium African countries have to pay because they are at risk of default. Actually, we are fulfilling the prophecy and ensuring that African countries will go into default by charging them huge amount of debt. How can you pay debt back if you're borrowing at 14% of it? How can you pay the debt back? Of course, you're driven into bankruptcy. Something needs to be done because it's unacceptable, illogical that the poor should pay much, much more when they borrow than the rich guys. Excuse me, why is that? This is one issue which I think also need to deal with. My point here is that until we deal with the issue of poverty in Africa, we'll always have problems and we'll end up asking for charity. I don't like asking for charity because we are a rich continent, but sometimes we are too stupid to really achieve what we should have in Africa. We are a rich country, but we need to stop the plundering of Africa, whether by corrupt people in Africa or corrupt people outside Africa. And that is my thesis here. But once again, thank you very much, Kailash and your team for the wonderful work you are doing, and I'm a great fan of yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mo Ibrahim. Dr. Mo has just reacted to the report because, as a speaker, this is what he was supposed to do. A challenge to everyone who is joining us today on the importance of reading this report and just finding out what we have unearthed from this report on the injustices in Africa. I will bring on my colleague, co-author, Owen James, who's going to, again, do a brief fact finding of what we found in our reports.
Thank you, Winnie. So, when we took a look at the increase during the SDGs, just before we broke, now we're looking at the change in GDP per person from 1980 to 2021. And what we see is that the huge increase in wealth in North America and Europe, in high-income countries, has not been matched in Africa. And in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, wealth has gone up by $96. It has increased more every 10 weeks in richer countries than it has in 41 years in sub-Saharan Africa. Even the next slowest growing region, South Asia, has grown 15 times more than sub-Saharan Africa since 1980. Historic injustices that have never been rectified left the world incredibly unequal in 1980. But something else in our world is making the situation even worse for children in Africa. So the report looked at modern injustices. What modern injustices could be causing such a trend? Why is Africa getting such a low share of global growth? Does it have the resources? Yes, huge natural resources, some of them the highest in the world. Are those resources valuable? Are they being used? Yes, many of them are rare and precious and in demand. Those resources are being used in the global economy. For example, in the DRC, it's in the top 10 countries with the most natural resources in the world. It produces over 70% of the world's cobalt that is used in batteries and mobile phones, laptops, now even electric cars. It has literally powered the tech boom that has added trillions to global growth in the last decade. But the profits are moved offshore. The billionaires are created in other countries, and such little tax is paid to the government in the DRC that they don't have the resources to provide basic services to all their children. Now, many children in the DRC are left so poor, they end up working in the very same cobalt mines to survive. So, the first injustice that we looked at was tax. Now, the graph that's coming up will show the average difference in tax revenue between child in Africa and in Europe. The revenue per child that governments have in sub-Saharan Africa is incredibly low, but this is actually an average value. Some 32 countries are even lower than this. That is why so many children in Africa have no doctor to see and no school to go to. The bars for Africa are too small to see the trends, but if we look at the other chart, the percentage change, you can see that even this terrible situation is getting rapidly worse, with tax revenue per child declining sharply since the start of the SDGs, in stark contrast to the increase in tax revenue per child in Europe. This means in practice a colossal fall in education and health budgets per child. Now, following OECD negotiations, the world introduced a fairer global tax deal last year, but they decided to simply exclude the extractive industries. The OECD has no African members, but they are in charge of the world's tax affairs. The report also looked at the inequality in the COVID-19 response. The UN was overlooked for the G7 and the G20 during the crisis. The G7 proudly highlighted their 12 trillion Global Agenda for Action package to support everyone through the pandemic. Yet 0.2%, just 0.2% went to the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And on top of that, as this map shows, vaccine apartheid took place, with African requests to manufacture their own vaccines turned down and richer countries stockpiling, whilst African countries didn't even have enough supplies for their doctors and their nurses. The next injustice is on the IMF special drawing rights. Last year, the IMF announced a new issue of special drawing rights during the pandemic. The IMF boasted that it would particularly help the most vulnerable countries who were struggling to cope. The historic 650 billion should have been much needed good news for children in Africa, denied COVID-19 funding and vaccines. However, the money was allocated extremely unfairly, as this graph shows how much funding each region received per child. Just $50 per African child compared to $2,500 per child in the European Union. And how did this happen? How did the UK and Belgium get more funds than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa put together? Is it population? No, they have a fraction of the population. It is because they have more votes than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa combined, and they have done since colonial times. This voting imbalance is why an African is not appointed to lead the IMF. When the most important financial organization in the world has to be led by a European, is it any wonder the global economic system is unjust? Now, this is the final injustice we're going to look at, because we're going to shorten the presentation today. But the final injustice is looking at aid. The 0.7% of GDP target for aid from rich countries has been in place for over 50 years, but only 8 countries have ever met it. The report found this injustice has been exacerbated by an increasing and shocking deprioritization of African children by donors. We calculated the fair share of aid each country would receive if aid was 0.7 and if the money was allocated where children needed it. This is in blue. This then compares with the aid given in orange. You can see that the rest of the world are gradually improving amount of fair share is received. The gap falls from 54% to 22%. In Africa, though, you see the opposite. Since 1990, the gap has grown from 44% or 55% to 77%. In 1990, all countries were treated the same. 30 years later, the shortfall for Africa children is over 3 times greater than outside of Africa. Now we're going to skip through to the summary of the report. If you bear with us just for a few moments, and then we will talk through the changes.
Owen, I'd like you to hold on that, on this summary before we come back to it. But so far you have highlighted from the tax injustice to the special drawing rights. Let me welcome our next speaker, the 2011 Nobel laureate, the incredible Lima Bowie. Lima is a peace activist, trained social worker, and women's rights advocate. She is the founder and the current president of the Bowie Peace Foundation. Miss Lima is among the few people who sat with us young people last year and agreed on the Justice for Africa statement, which has inspired this report. Auntie Lima, over to you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm very happy to be here, and congratulations to Kalash G for this amazing work. I know I've been on this journey with him over the last year as we've navigated the whole conditions of the children of Africa. I would like to clearly state that the report exposes one of the greatest tragedies of the 21st century, the injustices meted out against Africa's children. This report really shows us the discrimination, not just in the international handling of taxes and other sorts of funding, but also talks about the inefficiency and the lack of political will from African governments to deal with some of the issues affecting Africa's children. Let me briefly highlight, as a Liberian, we recently passed a budget of 700 million, almost 800 million. 88 million of that budget went towards education, 84 towards health, and 10 million only for agriculture. If we look at the increased suffering of Africa's children, you would tend to recognize that these 3 areas that are highlighted are those 3 areas that children are really impacted with. Hunger is a major issue in most communities, and that's one of the reasons when parents cannot feed their children, they will easily give them up to be laborers for others. Health, the lack of health care, and education, the absence of education for Africa's children. As we go through the report, you also see, and this is where I'm really passionate, the whole situation of adolescent girls. Girls tend to be one of the greatest threats, or the ones that are threatened the most in this whole situation of Africa's children. Beyond the child labor, early marriage, FGM, the whole thing of weighing between a girl and a boy in terms of education, the lack of access to sexual reproductive health and rights, the lack of access to reproductive material, also this early child marriage, the whole situation of fistula. So the health challenges that comes along with all of these things impacting girls is a very serious situation. The other issue that I would like to raise again is the whole education aspect. There's a lot of conversation going on in the world about girls' education. But if we look at Africa and look at the prioritization of education, girls continue to be left behind in the whole conduct of education in Africa. At the international level, as Owen recently, just spoke about some of the injustices that in terms of the tax bracket, when you compare Africa with places like Italy, you find that there are some countries in Africa that have more individuals, but less taxes when it comes to this. Also, let's talk about the OECD. Why don't we have Africa represented on the OECD? So even the conduct of our international organizations that are supposed to do justice to our world, we tend to see that these organizations are really and truly not giving justice. When Dr. Moore was speaking just now, he talked about Africa being a very rich continent, but our problem is governance. And then he talked about until we deal with poverty in Africa, we will continue to beg. And I mean, he really hit the nail on the head. But poverty is not just the end or a result or something that we have sitting in Africa. We're a very rich continent. Natural resource wise, if you come back to my own country, I always tell people that we're less than 5 million people in Liberia. We have timber, we have iron ore, we have gold and diamond, but we continue to be one of the poorest group of people in the world. And this has nothing to do with lack of wealth. It has a lot to do with governance. It has a lot to do with the inability of our governments to prioritize the people and their needs. And I think until we can really get our governments to begin to function in a way that protects the rights of children in Africa, the future of Africa will continue to be bleak. Nelson Mandela once said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And I think the soul of Africa is sick because the way our children are treated on the continent, until we begin to apply some of the medication, which is reimagining our humanity, we'll continue to see the problems that we have in Africa as it relates to the injustices, discrimination, and the suffering of African children. I think now is the time. We should no longer talk about it. It's time for us to push for tangible, results-driven position. I think we've had enough meetings. We should continue now to push our governments to give us things that will apply to the lives of children. Increase budgetary allocation around education, health, and agriculture. Really putting our foot down. Those laws that we have on child labor and child trafficking, we should push for implementation of those laws. I think this is a task that we all have. Kalash, you have my support. We'll continue to do this work until we see justice for Africa children. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lima. Now, I will take it back to Owen to do a summary of the report. Just a short summary, 2 minutes, and we're done. Then we have the tail end of our amazing speakers who are waiting, who are going to do their reactions, and then we will end the event. Owen.
Thank you very much, Winnie. So the final few slides, the final part of the presentation. What is the overall impact of these injustices? Financially speaking, we've been able to cost 9 of them. The details are in the report. These modern injustices come to just over 4 trillion combined. The international aspects account for 95%. Now, these figures are very rough. The injustice on COVID-19 has made the debt crisis worse, for example. The large file streaming off the page. But it's clear that the modern injustices, that are, whatever the estimates, they're worth several trillion in the first 6 years of the SDGs alone. And it's clear that the biggest financial injustices to Africa's children come from the international side. When you look at this graph, it's not so hard to see why child labor in Africa has been going up. But the heaviest cost is not measured in dollars, but it's measured in children's lives. And this final graph shows the number of children under 5 who have died in the first 5 years of the SDGs. The difference is huge. The only way to put it into context is to compare it with other numbers. More young African children have died in the first 5 years of the SDGs than all of the world's military victims during the 5 years of World War I. In fact, the number of unnecessary African child deaths each year is the same as the total US casualties by war since 1775. All the combat deaths, non-combat deaths, wounded, missing in action. Now, more films have been made about the grey bar chart, so maybe this is surprising for you. But the scale of injustice and inequality is titanic. And the most upsetting thing is that we know how to end poverty. Country after country has achieved it. Given the chance, people will lift themselves and their families out of poverty. We just need to end the injustices. There are two different types of solutions proposed by the Laureates and Leaders for Children and 100 million. The first, the Foundations for Justice, and the second, the child-targeted recommendation. The details are in the report, but it includes a call for a movement to create a firm foundation for justice for Africa's children, including advocating for fairer voting power and representation for African states in international fora, such as the G20 and the IMF. No African country is a member of the G7, and only one African country out of 54 is in the G20. The OECD has 38 member countries, but not a single one is African. And voting power at the World Bank and the IMF is dominated by non-African countries. This must change if we're to see change. Now, the Laureates and Leaders for Children also calls for the cancellation of unsustainable debt and fairer international tax and trade rules. Taxes must be paid in the countries from which profits are generated, including the extraction of Africa's natural resources. And ODA and climate financing must be increased with a fair share ring fence for low-income sub-Saharan African countries. And then, on the child-related recommendations, the swift instigation and financing of a global child benefit initiative to provide benefits to every child and new mother in a low-income country, and adequately financing expanded school feeding programs and education, in part by reallocation or new allocations for special drawing rights. It's time for justice for Africa's children. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Owen. What a rich report and recommendations. Once it is live, please get your hands on it. Our next speaker is the Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus.
Former Prime Minister Stefan Löfven, Nobel laureates Lema Gibwe and Kailash Satyarthi, Secretary General Martin Chungong, and Dr. Mo Ibrahim, dear colleagues and friends. Africa's 650 million children are a generation with great potential. But as the report being launched today shows, far too many of them are being held back by grave social injustices and daily risks to their health and lives. Last year, Nobel laureates and world leaders came together to demand justice for Africa's children. We must take action so that the children of Africa receive the health care they need and deserve. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us that when health is at risk, everything is at risk. But when health is promoted and protected, children, adults, communities, and nations can thrive. We call on all African governments to increase their investments in health, especially for key services for primary health care, routine immunization, school feeding, and reproductive health. WHO remains committed to supporting all African countries to strengthen their health systems as part of their journey towards universal health coverage. We continue to work closely with the Africa CDC to strengthen our continent's defense against outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. Investing in our children is an investment in the future and in the Africa we all want to see. A healthier, safer, fairer Africa. I thank you.
Lucia Isaac from the International Labour Organization. She is the head of the Governance and Tripartism Department, which provides advice and assistance on a range of topics related to the governance of labor and employment relations. Welcome, Mrs. Vera.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you, and thank you for having us, dear Kailash, and all laureates and representing here. For Dialogue is an honor to be joining this impressive panel of Nobel laureates and leaders gathered today to call for justice for African children. I must say that coming from Africa also is kind of, for me, going back and thinking about what is the best resources we have. How can we create space for children to grow and be citizens, children that can be having a decent work jobs. So let me go back to some points I wanted to make. The call that you launching today goes and resonates with what the ILO Director General, Gilbert Umbo, has called to future a social justice and decent work and join the global coalition for a better future. A future where all members of the society, regardless of their background or identity, have equal rights and opportunities. But unfortunately, the need for justice is greater than ever, and your report is summarizing many of them. So let me elaborate in one of these injustices that you mentioned, which is child labor, which is a violation of a fundamental principle of rights at work, a violations of the rights of the children. And my intervention will be looking from what you've been saying, the state of child labor in Africa. You did mention about the numbers. I'll be looking at international collaboration, but what could the recommendations, and your report has already mentioned some, so which brings kind of resonates what the ILO has been doing. Looking at the numbers, in 2020, you saw we launched the report with the ILO UNICEF, which had seen an increase of children in child labor in Africa, 92 million children in Africa. And this is what we're seeing is data collected prior to COVID-19. What the Dr. Moy Brain had indicated also is that we fear, because of children being following online courses, and we know what is the state of our region, that may have left a lot of children out of school, a lot of children that are not being allowed or could attend schools. So this is a wake-up call. And the wake-up call calls for an Africa needs to drive the change. If we want to achieve SDGs, there is need to engage. There is need to have a more engaging in an environment that we'll see with multiple crises coming and reinforcing each other. As the children are the most important resources, although the continent is one of the richest, our people are the most impoverished, and the children are impacted so much on that. My second point is how international community can react. And we did some, and this is where also we see that the convergence with the findings of the report, Justice for African Children report. We have been looking with African Union and working on how best why we have this increase of 20 million children in Africa in child labor. And what is interesting to see, which converse with your report, is that the African sub-regions most affected by child labor are Eastern, Western, and Central Africa. And these are also the regions in your report with higher rates of poverty and informal employment, and with the lowest social protection coverage. So in November 2021, with African stakeholders, we gathered in Johannesburg to discuss the priorities to accelerate and scale up action on child labor. They called for an increased focus on prevention. Africa, having the youngest continent with fast-growing population, inaction could lead to 105 million children in child labor by 2025, and many more in the following years. So as I said, there is need for a more engagement on this. Stakeholders also reiterated that governments have the main responsibility to end child labor. Public policies, and through the implementation of adequate finance policy measures, addressing root causes of child labor. And the previous speakers did mention that. How can we engage more? How can we fund actions that address the needs of the children? How can we increase our investment in education and the coverage of social protection? But most important also is how to engage more on having decent work for adults. So they agree that the need to invest in free education as an alternative of child labor, and that we need to promote decent jobs for adults and young adults, in particular in areas where child labor is prevailing. They also agreed about the social protection extension as a means of reducing vulnerability of the households. And finally, they stressed the need to increase financing to end child labor in Africa, in particular in domestic public funding, ODA, public-private partnerships. And I've been following my predecessors here in the panel, and really the issue about innovative financing is important, but also is how, at a global level, engagement to support actions and good governance at the country levels. So let me conclude by saying that the policy recommendation is that we need the social protection to end child labor, taking into account the fact that of 1 out of 5 of the African has access to at least one social protection measure. And our newly published report had strongly showed the link between the reduction of child labor when we invest in social protection. Other social protection tools could be health insurance and pensions are also important. Universal social protection and elimination of child labor are both a priority in the regional agenda of the African Union, governments, workers, and employers organizations, but they need to be acted. And I think this is one of the things that with this launch, we may engage to a more active and proactive action. So before closing my remarks, I'd like to express my deep appreciation to the Nobel laureates and leaders led by Kailash for their commitment, outstanding, and determining role in fighting injustice facing by African children. And you can count on the ILO to support the work of protecting children. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Barrett, there, representing the experts international organization that works on employment and labor issues. Our next speaker is the Secretary General of the Interparliamentary Union, Mr. Martin Chungong. So the IPU is the International Organization of National Parliaments, and it has a proud and long history and has worked to establish a number of institutions, including the UN. Martin is a tireless child labor advocate, probably amongst the strong advocates we have that are leading major international institutions. Mr. Martin Chungong, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Winnie. Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yes. Indeed, it is time to bring justice to Africa's children. That's what Owen said in his remarks, summing up the report that we are launching today. And I want to say that I agree entirely with that call to action. I could say that I'm pleased to join this event today, but when I look at what is contained in the report that we are launching, it makes for sobering and disheartening reading. We see flagrant injustice being meted out to vulnerable groups in society. And in this particular case, we are talking of a continent that is already vulnerable, Africa. And the statistics are very clear from what I've heard and read about the report that we're launching. But let me, first of all, thank and congratulate my brother Kailash for his tireless efforts in bringing about justice for children. And I am pleased, like Lema mentioned earlier, that I am part of this journey with him. We will continue to work to stamp out those injustices in society, especially in respect of children. And last year, I was pleased to participate in a number of events organized by Kailash and his foundation. And I did try to bring the parliamentary perspective to the discussions and provide some recommendations on what I think Parliament should be doing. A lot of what Parliament should be doing has already been clearly articulated by previous speakers. I heard Lema talk about the need to increase budgetary allocations for child welfare. I heard Dr. Tedros, my colleague next door, say that it was time to increase investments in health, especially for children. And these are things that are within the prerogatives of Parliament. And that is why I am very comfortable when I talk about some of these issues and make some of these recommendations, because I know that the actions are simple, they are straightforward, and they are within the powers of the legislative bodies and countries. And I'm striving to mobilize this support by parliaments. That is why I continue to elevate child rights, child labor to a level of priority at the IPU and its deliberations. And just last year, we had a very detailed discussion in a panel on leveraging budgetary allocations in support of children. And of course, I saw many parliamentarians from Africa taking part in those discussions. At the end, they resolved that organizations such as UNICEF, IPU, and the Committee on the Rights of the Child should help build capacity in parliaments to revise or devise legislation on promoting child welfare. And I think that this is something that we are following up on with a number of African parliaments. I look forward to our visit to Abuja, a visit with Kailash, to take the message to the ECOWAS Parliament. As we look at the recommendations in this report, as I was saying, there are lots of things that are disheartening, they are sad to hear, but those solutions that are there need to be prosecuted. And that is where there is, I think, the silver lining in the cloud. We are aware of the issues, and I think Lema made it very clear that we're done with having meetings. We need to act, and those actions are very clear and straightforward. I want to offer that I'll continue to mobilize parliaments to help correct the injustice that we have highlighted when it comes to African children. I say this because parliaments are supposed to represent society as a whole. That's in an egalitarian fashion. That is why they are elected by society. And so I don't see why they should not be forthcoming in supporting especially those vulnerable segments of society. So I'll continue to push for parliaments within the IPU to continue to work towards reviewing, reforming, devising legislation that would then be friendly to the welfare of children. And of course, the great power of budget allocation that parliaments wield should be used to good effect when it comes to children. So I want to use this opportunity here, not only to reiterate or express my concern over what is happening in Africa in terms of injustices for our children, in a way crying over spilled milk, but I want to say that we need to be more active and proactive in pushing those key stakeholders that are out there to make sure that they take action. And again, many of us have talked about pushing governments to make investments, to give pride of place or priority to child welfare. And parliaments have that potential to make their governments take action. They have that power over governments, and we need to push them to display that political commitment and also then make sure that we hold the feet of government to the fire for them to deliver on the rights of the child. So I conclude my comments this day to once again thank the Kailash Satyarthi Foundation and the Nobel laureates who are engaged in this campaign, this noble campaign that we have launched together. I want to congratulate them on shining the spotlight on the issue, but also indicating the solutions that can be implemented to alleviate the plight of children. I offer the support of the global parliamentary community to work to correct the injustices, the flagrant injustices that we are facing today. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I look forward to continuing our campaign with Kailash and the other Nobel laureates. Thank you very much, Winnie.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mr. Martin. Thank you for your leadership and your consistency. Our final speaker, carrying the aspirations of all the young people in this event today, is my brother, the SG, Mr. Peter Koji. Peter is the Secretary General of the All African Students Union, a representative of the National Students Union on the regional and global stage, representing over 30 million students and young people in Africa. Peter is also the co-founder of the 100 Million Campaign in Africa and a real, true champion for the rights of all young people in Africa. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you very much. I want to start by thanking for his vision, which continues to inspire us. And then I want to also say a special thank you to Owen for all the hard work that you put into making this report a reality, and I'm ready to help us to undertake campaigns. I also want to thank Georgia, Sherry, for all the dedication and commitment that you do to contribute to our fight for social justice every day. The report that we've looked at today, obviously, tells of the great injustice in the distribution and allocation of the resources. The speakers that have spoken before me have taken time to look at a number of them, and so I may just touch on a couple of them and then share a couple of thoughts about how I imagine that we can move forward. So what is clear is that we've seen that the rich countries continue to allocate money to themselves at the expense of the poorer countries. You'll ask yourself that how is it that like UK and Belgium alone have more than 48 countries put together? Yes.
Just sorry. Yes. Could you please mute and unmute? Your audio has a problem. We can't hear you clearly.
Okay. Just a second. Let me do that. Okay. Is it fine now? Is it better?
Yes.
Yeah. Is it better?
Yes. Please continue.
Oh, all right. Okay. Thank you. So you will ask yourself that how is it that the UK and Belgium alone have more voting power than 48 countries put together? How is it that $2,000 is allocated per European child and a paltry $60 per African child related to global COVID relief funds? You would again ask yourself, how is it that the OECD, the organization that negotiates tax deals, has no African members? It comes as no surprise when the OECD announced the results. Yes.
Sorry. Yeah, again? It's not off, but it's scratching. It's not clear, so we're not able to hear you well. It's scratching. We're losing you along the way.
Okay. Let me check this shortly. Wow. Okay. Is it okay now? Am I okay?
No, it's not.
Wow.
Do you want to? Yes. Could you please try again?
Okay. So how is it that the OECD, the country that represents, negotiates tax deals, has no African members? It comes as no surprise that when the OECD announced the global tax deal, it was intended to end profit shifting. It looked at its interest and not allow profit to move out of its member countries and allies, and simply excluded extractive industries from the new tax system. Something that, if it were done, would have immensely benefited Africa if it were included. Kenya, Nigeria, and other African countries strongly objected to this, but the deal went ahead anyway, and the international media barely reported on this. African countries have cut for school feeding programs and have continued to increase school fees at a time when they should rather be increasing allocations to these cost centers. But what do we do when the IMF, for example, tells African countries to remove such programs from its budget in the name of structural adjustments? The report further shows us that in the first 4 years of the SDGs, the number of child laborers in Africa have increased by over 20 million. Most of Africa's child laborers, as we know it, are under the age of 11, our present and our future. There are more child than there are children in the entire Europe. The number of children that are out of school at primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary levels in sub-Saharan Africa have increased by over 12 million. It's clear that the current order of things is unequal, it's biased, where resources are allocated not on a need basis, but on existing colonial power structures that are refusing to reform and adjust to a new world order, where equity, equality are the mainstays of a free world. Isn't it a shame that after global leaders from developed world preach equality in the pulpit, yet they still hold such significant and unequal power on the IMF, OECD, and other intergovernmental organizations? I'll end by sharing a story on how we can move and act now. So there is a story that is told about a cruel king who ruled over a very large province, introduced unequal taxes on the poor to boost the fortunes of the rich, and boasted about this. He held a dinner where visitors from far and wide came. They laughed, shared about their loots, and those who didn't like it still listened on and did not protest. And then all passed, and the day of reckoning came. They stood before a judge. Both the king and his allies were now equals. Judgment was passed, and they received various punishments. But the worst of the punishment was the complicit, those who watched on in silence and did nothing. We, the young people, have elected not to be complicit. We're choosing a path of resistance to sustained injustice. I want to use this platform to appeal to conscience. What are we doing as young people in response to the findings in the report? So the All Africa Students Union, together with the 100 Million campaign and the Global Student Forum and our allies from all over the world, have come together and we're working to fight for Africa through a campaign we have dubbed Don't Cut Our Future. This campaign will launch next month on the 20th of February. And we would want to ask for the support of world leaders like yourselves. And Dr. Kailashi has always been there to support us. Honorable Lema Bowe, Honorable Martin, all of them have been immensely supported over the years. And for a campaign such as this one, would need the support of world leaders to be able to make it a success. The power of solidarity is needed now more than ever. I'd want to use this opportunity to once again thank the 100 Million campaign for the wonderful work that we've done over the years together, and also for Kailashi for your vision, for always inspiring us and always cheering us on to do the unthinkable. Sir, what your vision does is it keeps us going and it inspires us. And so today we've all learned about the injustices in this world, particularly towards Africa, and would like you to stand up together with us as we ask the world to recreate the structures to make it fair for all of us. Once again, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing everybody as we campaign on the 20th of next month. Thank you.
Thank you so much, the SG. Wow, what a diverse and extremely thoughtful panel. And most importantly, to you, ladies and gentlemen, who have joined us today. That brings us to the end of our event today. The report is available now. Please go to the website, get your hands on the report, and get to see what we have unearthed. The injustices that are costing the lives of millions and millions of African children. We are actually looking at an imminent loss of a whole generation if our world leaders, if you and I, do not come together and work. Lastly, please interact with us on our various platforms, the Laureates and Leaders for Children and the 100 Million campaign. We want to work with you, just as Peter has said, and build a new movement to secure justice for Africa's children. I have been your moderator for today, Winnie Nyandiga. Thank you for joining us.